These are the most interesting historical photos and unusual objects from the past. Let's get 100,000 subscribers. This strange wooden barrel is a shandmantle, a medieval coat used in parts of Europe to publicly humiliate people accused of minor crimes. The inside was lined with rough metal, and the wearer had to stand in the street while neighbors mocked them. Nurses at St. Peter's Hospital in East London calmly clear a shattered ward after a 1941 air raid, working just inches from a gaping hole in the floor. During the Blitz, British hospitals often stayed open like this, treating patients inside buildings. After their plane went down in the Andes in 1972, these survivors used the torn fuselage as a shelter on a frozen mountain glacier for 72 days. 2 of them finally crossed the peaks on foot to find help, and a rescue helicopter returned to this Espio. In 1910, escape artist Harry Houdini let police lock him into a straitjacket and bind his legs so crowds could watch him slip free with no hidden help. He often repeated this stunt hanging from buildings or in front of newspapers to prove that even the strictest restraints could not hold him. In 1967, Canadian prospector Stephen Michalak lay in a hospital bed with a grid of strange burns on his chest after he said he walked up to a glowing craft near Falcon Lake. Doctors could treat his illness but never fully explain the pattern on his skin. Smiling boys carry heavy planks to build street barricades during the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, turning their own neighborhood into a small fortress. The uprising lasted 63 days, and by the time it was crushed, most of Warsaw lay in ruins. Chinese troops run training drills under the mushroom cloud of Project 596, China's first atomic test in 1964. Many of these soldiers later suffered strange health problems, but the full numbers and records remain secret to this day. A Spanish muskrat trapper on Delacroix Island, Louisiana, in 1941 hangs his catch to dry so the fur will be easier to work. At the time, muskrat pelts were valuable enough that a skilled trapper could support an entire family from winter seasons like this. Workers stand inside a giant circular mine and tunnel for the Snowy Mountains hydroelectric power plant in Australia. It became one of the largest engineering structures, run by thousands of migrant workers who broke through solid rock. During World War II, British scientists used this remote Scottish island to test a secret biological weapon that left the ground unsafe for decades. The same plan, called Operation Vegetarian, would have scattered poisoned cattle feed over enemy farms. Police officers brace a wooden barrier as a wave of screaming Beatles fans presses forward outside the Ed Sullivan Theater in New York in 1964. The band's first live television appearance here sparked Beatlemania across America almost overnight. A Japanese Kai 61 fighter plunges past the carrier USS Sangamon in this blurred photo, missing the crowded flight deck and only snapping off antennas on 4th of May, 1945. Just 30 minutes later, a second aircraft, a Kai-45, struck the deck and the ship lost 11 crew members in the blast and fire. Workers pose around a gigantic steel spiral casing in Milwaukee in 1920, built to feed water into a 70,000 horsepower turbine at Niagara Falls. This single machine could power an entire city block by block, turning the force of the waterfall into silent electric light miles away. Workers inspect the collapsed ceiling of a Munich beer hall where a bomb exploded on 8 November 1939, missing Adolf Hitler by about 13 minutes. The blast took 8 lives at his old rally hall, and historians still debate how different the war might have been if his schedule had changed that night. In 1980, a young Vladimir Putin posed for this official portrait as an officer of the Soviet KGB, long before he became a national leader. He spent the 1980s in quiet intelligence work, including a posting in East Germany, learning languages and skills. Fire crews and neighbors picked through twisted cars and rubble after an explosion at the O'Connor electroplating plant in Los Angeles on February 20, 1947. The blast hurled metal for blocks, left 17 people lost. This bottle holds a pharmacy cannabis alcohol tonic from the early 1900s with 74% alcohol and a big poison warning on the neck. Before modern drug rules, American chemists sold plant-based mixtures like this over the counter for pain, sleep. Master butcher Turek Sandor stands with his two sons behind their woolly Mangalica pig, which weighs an incredible 420 kilograms in Hungary in 1922. This curly-haired breed was once famous for its rich fat and almost disappeared in the 20th century before farmers brought it back. This is the Soviet Lun-class Ekranoplan, a giant rocket-armed sea skimmer that flew only a few meters above the waves in the late 1980s. It was so unusual and expensive that only one was ever finished, and it sat abandoned on the Caspian coast for decades. In 1931, a Berlin museum used full skeleton models posed at workbenches to teach visitors about safety at work. The eerie classroom showed how bad posture and careless tool use could quietly damage the body long before anyone noticed. In 1937, these two men demonstrated periscope top hats, novelty hats with mirrors that let the wearer see over crowds without lifting a finger. The strange gadgets were part fashion joke, part early attempt at giving city gentlemen a built-in extra viewpoint. In 1980, engineers strapped rows of rockets onto a C-130 transport plane so it could leap into the air and stop almost like a helicopter for a rescue in Tehran. Test flights ended in serious crashes, and the bold plan was canceled, while the Americans held in Iran were later freed through negotiation instead. Ray Tomlinson, the engineer who sent the first networked email in 1971, later posed with the now famous @. He chose to separate user and machine names. His simple choice of that symbol helped turn early ARPANET messages into the global email system. On a September afternoon in 1920, a horse-drawn wagon packed with explosives exploded outside the New York Stock Exchange, flipping cars and shattering windows for blocks. 40 people lost their lives. Hundreds were injured. President John F. Kennedy leans in to study John Glenn's tiny Mercury capsule, Friendship 7, just days after Glenn became the first American to orbit Earth in February 1962. Looking at the scorched metal up close, the president could see exactly how small the machine. Soviet paratroopers sprint across a field near Kiev in 1935, while hundreds of white parachutes still drift down behind them. These huge maneuvers were meant to shock foreign observers, showing that the Red Army could quietly drop an entire airborne brigade far behind any border. This pistol set recalls an 1850 duel on Angel Island near San Francisco, where court clerk George Penn Johnston faced State Senator William Ferguson. Johnston fired first, and the senator fell before he had a chance to pull his own trigger. Tens of thousands of people packed this field at Crush, Texas in 1896 to watch a staged head-on train crash as a publicity stunt. The impact blew both boilers apart, hurling metal into the crowd and leaving many injured and 2 people who did not survive. Director Fritz Lang stands above a sea of extras on the set of Metropolis in 1925, carefully arranging their movements for a mass crowd scene. In 1875, a Mormon missionary stands in a muddy pond near St. George, Utah, baptizing a Paiute man while the rest of the tribe watches from the bank. In 1917, this early ice resurfacer used a small motor car to pull a scraper and water tank across the rink long before the first Zamboni appeared in 1949. The machine shaved rough ice, then spread a thin layer of warm water to leave a fresh skating surface. In 1907, this African-American crew tightened bolts to seal the steel lining of the Pennsylvania Railroad's North River Tunnel under the Hudson River. Many such workers labored far below water level in compressed air and mud to open a direct rail route into New York City. Around 1900, rural hunters sometimes carried smaller black bears home, whole like this, instead of dressing them in the forest. In many regions, bear meat, fat, and fur were key resources, used for food, lamp oil, and winter clothing. A U.S. battleship lists and burns in thick smoke at Pearl Harbor during the surprise air raid of December 7, 1941. The devastation in this harbor that morning pushed the United States fully into the Second World War. The hydrogen balloon Örnen of Swedish explorer Salomon André drifts away from Svalbard in July 1897 at the start of his attempt to reach the North Pole by air. The balloon crashed onto the Arctic ice after about 2 days, and the 3 men were found dead on a remote island 33 years later. Laid out on a table in Seoul in 1969 are the books, code sheets, and radio gear taken from a captured North Korean agent. The display was arranged for press photos to show how spies carried hidden communications equipment into the South. This front page from the Spokesman Review on April 15, 1912, announces that the Titanic, with 2,160 people aboard, has struck an iceberg and is sinking. Early reports like this still underestimated the scale of the disaster. In this parking lot in Texas City in 1947, rows of cars are visible, crumpled and burned by the shock wave from the ship Grand Camp. The ship was carrying about 2,000 tons of ammonium nitrate, and its sudden detonation remains one of the largest industrial explosions in the history of the United States. Rescuers and onlookers stand beside the shattered carriages of the Tangiwai Express after it plunged into the Wanggehu River on Christmas Eve 1953. A volcanic mudflow had just torn away the bridge, and 151 people died in what is still New Zealand's worst rail accident. An aerial photo shows the village of Odatong almost fully underwater during the North Sea flood of February 1, 1953. That storm surge broke more than 150 Dutch dikes and cost over 1,800 lives. Chinese Americans in 1939 hold hand-painted signs at a U.S. dock, pleading to stop scrap iron shipments to Japan. At the time, the United States was still selling Japan millions of tons of metal that could be melted down into weapons used in China. Former railway workers with missing limbs stand by a water pump at a home for disabled employees in what is now Belarus, 1901. Many big rail companies ran such institutions, offering small pensions, housing, and basic care to staff injured on the job. This aerial view of the Nevada test site shows dozens of craters left by underground nuclear test explosions carried out from the 1950s onward. In total, the United States conducted over 900 tests here, reshaping the desert surface into a pockmarked landscape. Project Blue Peacock was a British plan in the 1950s to hide nuclear landmines in West Germany as a last resort against a Soviet tank advance. Designers even suggested putting live chickens inside the buried casings to keep the timing gear warm. A U.S. Marine Corps F-4U Corsair fires a ripple of FFAR rockets at ground positions on Okinawa in June 1945. Smoke on the island below marks Marine units moving inland under close air support in the last major Pacific Island campaign. Ole Kirk Christiansen stands with his family in the ruins of his Billund workshop after a devastating fire in 1942 destroyed his wooden toy factory. From this setback he rebuilt, shifted to plastic toys, and within a few years created the studded bricks that became Lego. Albert Fish, one of the most notorious criminal offenders in early 20th century New York, is escorted through a courthouse corridor by police in 1935. His arrest and later trial shocked the public and fueled an era of sensational crime reporting in American newspapers. Irish Republican volunteers Patrick Moran and Thomas Whelan shake hands in Mountjoy Prison, Dublin, March 1921. Both men had been sentenced to death by British authorities for their alleged role in intelligence shootings during the Irish War of Independence. In 1942, 22 Australian Army nurses captured on Banka Island by Japanese forces were marched into the sea, and only one nurse survived the shooting. After the war, her testimony about the attack was tightly restricted by officials during the Tokyo War Crimes hearings. A U.S. C-130 releases Agent Orange herbicide over Vietnam during the war. The dioxin in this chemical stayed in soil and food chains for decades, contributing to serious health issues and birth defects long after the spraying ended. In 1917, during World War I, the U.S. War Industries Board asked American women to stop buying metal-framed corsets so the steel could be used for the military. That change helped popularize the modern bra and permanently shifted everyday women's fashion. American women of the U.S. Army's Experimental Camouflage Unit test shrub-like suits in a wooded suburb of New York, c. 1918. Such trials helped designers learn how to hide soldiers and equipment from enemy observation in World War I. Unmarried Irish mothers work without pay in a Magdalen laundry, where church-run institutions confined so-called fallen women well into the late 20th century. Many of their babies were taken away and adopted out, often without the mother's consent. Air mechanic Freddie Jackson was killed by an airplane propeller in 1919, 2 days before this Royal Air Force group photo was taken. When the image was developed, his former comrades thought they recognized his face in the back row. German soldiers moved through the ruins of Stalingrad during house-to-house fighting in 1943. The months-long battle left most of the city destroyed and became a key turning point on the Eastern Front in World War II. Armenian girls in New York City pose in mourning clothes in 1917, holding a sign for "Our 1,000,000 Lost." Their appeal asks Americans to help the remaining 1,500,000 Armenians displaced by the First World War. A U.S. Air Force B-29 Superfortress releases a string of bombs over the mountains of Korea during the Korean War in February 1951. These long-range bombers flew from bases in Japan and Okinawa to strike strategic supply lines deep in the peninsula. Syrian leader Hafez al-Assad faces reporters after learning that Egyptian President Anwar Sadat will visit Israel in 1977. The surprise trip breaks the common Arab line on Israel and leaves Assad suddenly alone in the region. Austro-Hungarian trench raiders pose in gas masks near Caporetto in the winter of 1917. These hand-picked soldiers trained for silent night missions on the icy mountain front between Italy and Austria. British infantry with fixed bayonets rehearse an attack for the camera far behind the real front lines in World War I. Scenes like this were later shown in cinemas as if they were filmed in no man's land, shaping how millions imagined the war. The giant fuselage of the Hughes H-4 Hercules, later called the Spruce Goose, crawls through a California street on its way to final assembly in 1947. For one short flight, it became the largest flying boat ever built, a wooden answer to the dream of massive long-range air travel. A Soviet prisoner of war is photographed at Bjørnelva camp in Saltdal, Norway in 1945, his eyes brighter than his worn body. He stands at the end of years of freezing labor in the Arctic, a reminder that many others from these camps never came home. Smokey, a small black terrier, served as the official mascot of the 1932 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles. Wearing a cape with the Olympic rings, he trotted around the venues and charmed athletes and visitors from all over the world. Neil Armstrong stands in his shiny Gemini spacesuit in 1966, 3 years before he would step onto the moon. In the Gemini 8 mission, he performed the first docking in space and then calmly saved the craft after a wild spin, proving he could handle the unknown. Swedish Constable Kalle Johansson stands alone with his saber drawn in front of a tense crowd in Linköping on 5 September 1943. Neutral Sweden still had to manage strong street protests over events in wartime Europe. An Ethiopian Jewish teacher points to Hebrew words on a cracked mud wall in 1979, turning a simple hut into a doorway to another world. Many in this community were quietly preparing for the day they would leave Africa and speak this language in a new home. Before he was a famous talk show host, Larry King posed for this police photo in Dade County, Florida, on 20 December 1971 over a disputed $5,000 payment linked to a New Orleans legal investigation. The all-black U.S. 15th Regiment marches proudly down Fifth Avenue in New York in 1916 as crowds line the street and flags hang from the buildings. Soon these men would fight in Europe and earn a reputation as some of the most trusted frontline troops in the American Army. On 8 September 1923, 7 United States Navy destroyers struck the rocks at Honda Point after one navigation error in fog, leaving this quiet California coast filled with broken steel. It is still the largest peacetime loss of United States Navy destroyers. A Russian soldier looks up at the ruined government building in Grozny during the First Chechen War in the mid-1990s. The empty windows and cratered ground show how a busy city center could turn into a silent field of concrete in just a few months. A Chinese tin worker carries heavy metal ingots at a British smelting plant in Malaya in 1941, his muscles showing the cost of this hidden industry. Tin from workers like him flowed into factories and war machines around the world. Workers at the Sloss Sheffield Steel and Iron Company in Jefferson County, Alabama, pose after a shift in 1910, including boys who are barely in their teens. At a time before strong labor laws, these young miners could spend 12 hours a day underground. A huge Soviet strategic missile rolls through Red Square around 1963 under giant portraits of Lenin, Marx, and Engels as cameras and officers watch. These parades were staged to convince both citizens and foreign spies that the Soviet Union had powerful rockets ready. Donald Campbell's jet boat Bluebird lifts out of Coniston Water at about 300 miles per hour on 4 January 1967. Seconds after this frame, the world record attempt ended in tragedy, and the craft would rest on the lakebed for decades before being raised. This roadside sign from the 1930s shows that a 20-cent gallon of gasoline only cost about 5.5 cents in actual fuel. The rest went to state and federal taxes, railroads, agents, and even the station owner, proving most of the money never reached the oil itself. In 1912, this local newspaper calmly explained that burning 2 billion tons of coal a year would wrap the earth in carbon dioxide and warm the air. More than a century later, the short note looks like an early forecast of the climate debates. In 1954, a visitor at the American Museum of Atomic Energy in Oak Ridge lets a remote-controlled robot arm carefully fix her lipstick. The same type of mechanical hands was designed to handle dangerous lab work behind thick glass. On 20 December 1951, these 4 light bulbs in Idaho became the first ones ever lit by power from a working nuclear reactor, EBR-1. The tiny string of lights proved that atoms could run generators. Fritz Dietel, the Stilt Man, glides across the Wembley ice in 1937 on special skating stilts, while 4-year-old Pat Kemp calmly poses between his legs. His circus-style stunt turned a normal ice rink into a place where even balance and gravity looked like a quiet joke. American soldiers lie in rough earth trenches in the Philippines in 1899, firing their Springfields toward unseen local fighters. Just a year after arriving as supposed liberators from Spain, the United States found itself in a long, bitter island war that would claim far more lives than the battle that started it. At 14 in 1929, Les Paul built this wireframe so he could play harmonica and guitar at the same time on street corners. His homemade gadget became the classic harmonica holder copied by musicians from Bob Dylan to Bruce Springsteen. British Royal Marine Commandos climb into folding canoes from a submarine for Operation Frankton in the Bay of Biscay in 1942. Paddling by night for miles up the Gironde, they slipped into Bordeaux Harbor and damaged several cargo ships. Norwegian commandos on skis dragged supplies through deep snow in 1943 during Operation Gunnerside in occupied Norway. Their raid sabotaged the Vemork heavy water plant and quietly pushed German nuclear research far behind that of the Allies. The Japanese heavy cruiser Mikuma lists and burns after dive bomber hits during the Battle of Midway in June 1942. Her loss, frozen in this frame, marked part of the moment when Japanese sea power began to slip and the Pacific balance quietly turned. A Japanese Mitsubishi Zero lines up on the tilted deck of the escort carrier USS White Plains in the Pacific in 1944. The pilot was part of a special crash attack unit, but this attempt missed the ship, leaving only scorch marks and shaken sailors behind. Major Bernhard Kruger, seen in this post-war mugshot, ran Operation Bernhard, a secret German project to print near-perfect fake British pound notes in World War II. His team produced millions of forged bills that were used to pay agents and buy supplies. In the early Cold War, the United States tested a bizarre plan to drift agents into the Soviet Union using high-altitude weather balloons launched from ships at sea. Winds proved too wild and landing zones too random, so the sky route for spies was quietly abandoned. The Dakota stands like a lone palace on the rough edge of New York's Upper West Side around 1890, surrounded by rock, mud, and horse carts. At the time, this luxury building was so far from Midtown that people joked it might as well be out near the Dakota Territory. On the deck of the SS Manhattan in 1936, Jesse Owens practices his jump in a suit and tie on the way to the Berlin Olympic Games. Days later, he would win 4 gold medals, quietly shattering the host nation's myth of racial superiority in front of the world. Russian aviator Pyotr Krisanov stands on a frozen field beside his fragile Newport 14 in the winter of 1915, wrapped in leather and a bright scarf. Decorated with all 4 classes of the St. George Cross, he would later be lost in an air battle in 1917. A wall of dust called Black Sunday rolls toward the people of Tyrone, Oklahoma on 14 April 1935, turning afternoon into night in minutes. Storms like this stripped millions of tons of topsoil from the Great Plains and pushed entire farming families to leave the Dust Bowl behind. On 16 June 1963, Soviet cosmonaut Valentina Tereshkova appears on this grainy screen during her 5th orbit in Vostok 6, the first woman ever to circle Earth. Her 3-day solo flight logged more time in space than all American astronauts had flown up to that moment combined. In 1950, a teacher in Finland serves hot soup right in the classroom, part of a new law that gave every child a free daily school meal. Finland was one of the first countries in the world to guarantee this warm lunch for all pupils, no matter how poor their families were. In about 1950, this boy experiments with the Gilbert Atomic Energy Lab, a children's kit that came with real uranium ore, a Geiger counter, and a working cloud chamber. Sold as a fun way to learn atomic science. Mount Vesuvius sends a towering cloud of ash into the sky during its March 1944 eruption, the last major burst from the volcano that buried Pompeii. Allied troops stationed nearby watched this scene from their camp. A jeep packed with smiling United States Marines rolls across Iwo Jima in March 1945, soon after the island was declared secured. The joy on their faces hides weeks of hard fighting on a tiny patch of volcanic rock in the Pacific. On 27 May 1937, officials used a welder's torch to cut this ceremonial chain and open the Golden Gate Bridge to the public. Within minutes, thousands of people began walking and driving across what was then the longest suspension bridge in the world. Amelia Earhart adjusts radio gear inside her Lockheed Electra in 1937, personally checking every wire before her planned flight around the world. A few months after this photo, her plane vanished over the Pacific and turned her name into one of aviation's greatest mysteries. In New York in 1935, men sign up at a street table to volunteer for Ethiopia after news of the Italian invasion. Many of these hopeful recruits were later blocked by travel and passport rules, so their support for the distant African empire stayed mostly on paper. The Queens of the Air acrobats of Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus pose in 1935, every smile hiding years of bruises, practice, and perfect timing. These women performed high above the ring with no harness or safety net. A lonely sign on the fence announces that this 135-acre farm near New Carlisle, Ohio, will be sold at public auction in 1935. During the Great Depression, scenes like this meant a family was losing land. It had worked for years as banks and unpaid bills closed in. Jewish soldiers of the German army crowd into a wartime synagogue service in 1915, some still wearing field caps and carrying prayer books. Around 100,000 Jewish troops fought for Germany in the First World War. United States Marines ride shotgun on an armored mail truck in 1921 after a wave of bold robberies made postal runs feel like bank trains in the Wild West. For a time, the government's answer was simple and very visible: put combat troops with rifles on the mail. Shirtless in the heat, a foundryman pours glowing iron into sand molds at the Portland Stove Foundry in Maine in 1970. Within a few years, many of these hand-casting shops would close or modernize. On a Nebraska ranch in 1875, a young cowboy fires near an older man's boots, making him hop in a nervous dance while other hands watch. The rough joke shows how casual gunplay and power games. In 1923, crowds cheered as diving horses were led up tall towers and sent plunging into small pools below, a strange mix of circus act and daredevil show. During Hurricane Ian in 2022, this Florida home's glass wall held back a brown wall of floodwater, like an inside-out aquarium. The storm surge pushed thousands of liters against a few millimeters of engineered glass, which flexed instead of breaking. Annie Leibovitz captured John Lennon wrapped around Yoko Ono in their New York apartment on the morning of December 8, 1980. Just hours later, he would leave this building for the last time, turning the portrait into an accidental farewell to a global music era. Some German clergy publicly cooperated with the new regime in the 1930s, hoping to protect church privileges and influence. Decades later, photos like this became key evidence in debates over how far religious leaders went in accommodating dictatorship. These French circus clowns turned themselves into living cartoons with padded suits, giant ears, and toy pistols. One even carried a small dog in his belly pocket as part of the act. Long before Hollywood space epics, this 1919 British film imagined bug-eyed moon creatures welcoming awkwardly dressed Earth explorers. Audiences who had never seen a rocket in real life were already watching humans meet aliens on the big screen. This bizarre gentleman pig is a costumed performer from the 1907 French silent short The Dancing Pig, where he chases and wiggles across the stage in a surreal burlesque act. Early audiences saw it as comedy, but its jittery movements and unsettling mask now make it one of the strangest relics. Civilians pack a city street, queuing shoulder to shoulder for scarce bread rations in the freezing wartime winter. In blockaded cities like Leningrad or Warsaw, hours in lines like this often decided who ate that day and who went hungry. Soldiers advanced through a ghostly gas cloud in World War I, when toxic chemicals were first used on a large scale. Decades later, doctors studying how these gases wiped out white blood cells turned the same chemistry into the first modern cancer treatments. In World War I, German agents quietly tried to buy up almost every new hydraulic press coming out of U.S. factories, hoping to choke off American artillery shell production before it even began. It was an early example of shadow warfare waged not on battlefields, but in order books and factory floors. In 1916, Berlin ordered a special census of Jewish soldiers, hoping to prove they were dodging the trenches. The survey quietly showed the opposite. Jews were overrepresented at the front, fighting and dying for the Kaiser in higher numbers than many of their critics. On the Western Front in WWI, British crews manhandle 1,400-pound shells nicknamed pillbox demolishers, each as heavy as a small car. When they detonated, they blasted craters over 15 feet deep and 15 yards wide, erasing concrete bunkers in a single thunderclap. German troops crouch in a muddy trench, while a new flamethrower sends a pillar of fire roaring down the line, April 4, 1917. This terrifying invention turned close-quarters trench raids into scenes of blazing chaos long before tanks or aircraft dominated the battlefield. These brothers from the Titanic's crew stand packed into a carriage, one of the rare families that all came home. They stepped off the lifeboats with matching uniforms and a story their whole town would whisper about for years. In 1943, this captured Japanese mini-sub lay wrecked beside the rails on a remote Aleutian island, a strange trophy from the northern edge of the Pacific War. Nearly 80 years later, its rusted hull still rests in the tundra like a forgotten steel fossil, slowly sinking back into the landscape. The Royal Navy's experimental M-class submarines carried a full-size 12-inch battleship gun, fired while the boat was barely surfaced, so only the barrel and periscope showed. The idea was to ambush enemy ships with a single giant shell instead of torpedoes. Victorian gyms used strange wooden contraptions like this to stretch and strengthen the body long before modern fitness brands existed. It looks like a medieval torture rack, but it was marketed as cutting-edge health technology for fashionable city dwellers. Daryl Hannah relaxes in her custom mermaid tail between takes, with Tom Hanks, Eugene Levy, and John Candy on the set of Splash, 1984. The fiberglass tail was so heavy she had to be lifted with a crane between scenes, while those mainframe computers hummed in the background of 1980s Hollywood. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the bankruptcy barrel became a visual joke for men who had lost everything, drawn in cartoons as if they owned only the barrel on their shoulders. The gag was so famous that real-life prank punishments copied it. Jedburgh teams were tiny three-man units of the American OSS and British SOE that parachuted into occupied France just before D-Day. They linked up with local resistance groups, coordinated supply drops, and directed attacks on rail lines and communications to paralyze German responses to the invasion. A lone trapper poses beside his loaded handcar on remote railway tracks in northern Alberta, 1910. The furs hanging from the cart show how trappers used new rail lines to move deep woods catches to distant markets. Soviet hospital workers perform mandatory workplace gymnastics under Lenin's portrait in Ulyanovsk, USSR, 1981. Short exercise breaks like this were promoted across the Soviet Union to keep staff healthy and productive. Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. Smoke towers above burning battleships on Battleship Row as rescue boats race through the harbor. Sailors on Ford Island watch the chaos from only a few hundred meters away, still unsure how many ships have been lost. 2 American servicemen used the shattered remains of a bomber as an improvised bunker at Hickam Field, hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. The wrecked engine cowling and sandbags show how quickly the airfield was turned from peacetime base into a frontline position. In 1917 Rhymes, a small girl calmly plays with her doll while perched on a soldier's pack. Beside her, stacked rifles and rolled blankets wait in silence for their owners to return. Police officers stand guard outside 10 Rillington Place in Notting Hill, London, during the investigation of John Christie's infamous criminal case in 1953. The shabby doorway behind them hid evidence of multiple grim crimes that shocked Britain. In September 1940, 14-year-old Marcel Ravidat and his friends climbed into this hidden hole in the hills of Dordogne, France, after his dog Robot slipped into a narrow opening. Inside, they found the Lascaux Cave, its walls covered with vivid paintings made about 17,000 years ago. At Wellington Airport on 20 October 1966, United States President Lyndon B. Johnson leans over the barbed wire fence to greet excited children in New Zealand. His visit made him the first sitting American president to reach the country, a moment many locals still remember. At midnight in 1997, Hong Kong police officers quietly swapped the royal badge on their caps for the new Hong Kong emblem as crowds watched. In a few seconds, their uniforms showed the end of more than 150 years of British rule and the start of Chinese sovereignty. In 1960, a smiling Elvis Presley shakes hands with young British radio host Jimmy Savile as they show off their record awards. Today, this cheerful backstage moment feels strangely loaded because history would remember these two men in very different ways. In 1989 in Pyongyang, South Korean student activist Lim Soo-kyung links hands and dances with North Korean students in the middle of a city parade. She had slipped into the Democratic People's Republic of Korea for a youth festival. In 1935, at Madame Tussauds in London, workers carry the seated wax figure of British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain past wax models of the era's rising strongmen. Within a few years, the real men behind these frozen faces would pull Europe into the Second World War. In 1962, at Wittenoom in Western Australia, workers cheerfully raced to shovel raw blue asbestos tailings into metal drums as part of a shoveling contest. Few people there knew that the pale dust swirling around them would later be linked to serious health problems across the world. In 1924, this young bootblack in New York City beams at the camera while carrying the heavy box he used all day to shine shoes. Photos like this were later used by reformers to push for child labor laws that limited the hours children could work. Crow Scout White Man Runs Him stands at the 1926 gathering, wearing traditional clothing and holding the kind of rifle that once guided United States cavalry through this land. His calm face and steady posture hint at memories of the Little Bighorn that he never fully shared with outsiders. Dock workers in wartime London load timber and heavy sacks as ships prepare to leave the crowded pier. Every crane and barge in this frame shows how the port worked at full speed to keep the country supplied during the Second World War. Fidel Castro lines up a putt while Che Guevara watches in 1959, just months after their revolution nationalized every golf course across Cuba. Castro soon banned the sport completely as a symbol of American capitalism, converting the fairways into military training grounds and sugarcane plantations. Allied medics unload a stretcher case at a former Italian prison that has been turned into an emergency aid post during the Second World War in Italy. The Jeep ambulance, shattered brick walls, and small surgery sign at the doorway show how medical teams worked only a short distance behind the battle line. San Francisco, April 1942. Families of Japanese ancestry report under Executive Order 9066 with numbered tags and only what they can carry. 2/3 were United States citizens and were processed at city assembly centers before transport to 10 inland relocation sites. British soldiers hold 2 teenagers for an identity check on a Belfast street in 1978, at the height of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Emergency laws let patrols stop and search residents in Catholic neighborhoods without warning, so this graffiti-marked corner works as a sudden checkpoint instead of a normal hangout spot. Katie Sanduina, born Katharina Brumbach in 1884, was a circus strongwoman who once outlifted famous bodybuilder Eugen Sandow and could press about 130 kilograms overhead. She toured with Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey, ending shows by raising her 150-pound husband above her head with one arm while backing women's voting rights. Soldiers inflate tethered observation balloons with gas before sending them above the First World War front lines to spot enemy artillery positions and troop movements. These huge fabric spheres could stay over the trenches for hours, guiding friendly gunfire by telephone line and forcing enemy pilots into risky low attacks to try to bring them down. United States infantrymen in the Battle of Bastogne, winter 1944, smash a house door with rifles and a rocket launcher to reach German snipers inside. Street fighting in the frozen Ardennes forced small squads like this to clear each building room by room to protect the surrounded town of Bastogne. Budapest, October 1956. Protesters tore down the 25-meter Stalin monument in Felvonulási Square and hauled the bronze head through the streets. Only the boots remained on the pedestal, turning into the revolution's most famous symbol. Winter 1950, on the Hagaru perimeter at the Chosin Reservoir, United States Marines watch F-4U Corsairs strike Chinese positions that block the narrow escape road. In these sub-zero mountains, coordinated attacks like this helped the surrounded 1st Marine Division fight its way south toward evacuation at Hungnam Harbor. Coastal homes along the Gulf of Mexico are hammered by waves and rising water as Hurricane Elena stalls just offshore in 1985. The storm's looping, unpredictable path forced repeated evacuations from Florida to Louisiana before it finally came ashore in Mississippi. USS Bigor stands offshore on December 24, 1950, as demolition charges destroy Hungnam port facilities after the largest military sea lift since Okinawa evacuated over 100,000 troops and refugees. Engineers blew up piers, fuel depots, and warehouses to deny the harbor to advancing Chinese forces just hours after the last ship departed. Over 20,000 Albanians crowd the freighter Vlora and the pier at Bari in August 1991, fleeing their country's post-communist economic collapse. Italian authorities temporarily confined most of the new arrivals in the city stadium before sending many of them back to Albania within days. On March 20, 1948, an unexpected tornado slammed into Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma, tossing heavy bombers like toys and causing more than $10 million in damage. Shaken by the loss, base meteorologists issued the first official United States tornado forecast 5 days later, and when another twister hit on March 25th, their accurate warning quietly launched modern severe storm prediction. Inside the B-17G Flying Fortress, Little Miss Mischief, the fuselage is ripped open and the radio room shredded after flak and fighter hits during a raid on Cologne, Germany on 15 October 1944. Despite this damage, the crew kept the bomber in the air long enough to return to England, making the aircraft one of the 8th Air Force's most famous survivors. Czechoslovak Legion troops guard a section of the Trans-Siberian Railway around 1920, wearing mosquito nets over their heads while manning trench mortars in the Siberian summer. Stranded in Russia after the First World War, these volunteers controlled hundreds of kilometers of track as they fought their way east toward evacuation ports on the Pacific. A Royal Navy depth charge erupts beside the cruiser HMS Ceylon in 1942 as the ship attacks a suspected submarine contact. The towering water column shows how these timed underwater blasts were used to crush submarine hulls without any direct hit. At Funchalen Pass during the Chosin Reservoir Retreat in December 1950, United States Marines face a destroyed bridge that cuts the only road south through the frozen Korean mountains. Air Force transports soon drop portable bridge sections by parachute, so engineers can rebuild this gap and let the trapped column reach Hungnam for evacuation. December 1950, Chosin Reservoir. United States Marines reach the destroyed bridge at Funchalen Pass that blocks their only road south through the Korean mountains. Cargo planes then drop portable bridge sections by parachute, so engineers can rebuild the span and reopen the escape route to Hungnam. Barcelona, summer 1936. Neighborhood kids stack paving stones into a street barricade and raise clenched fists, copying the defenses they have just watched militias build. Only weeks into the Spanish Civil War, even children in Catalonia were already turning sidewalk games into rehearsals for life behind real front lines. Ans van Dijk stands in a Dutch courtroom in 1947, on trial for handing over fellow Dutch Jews in hiding to the German occupation police during the war. She was convicted on multiple counts of collaboration and executed under Dutch law in 1948, the only Dutch woman put to death after the Second World War. In the early 1900s, 2 women pose in wedding dress and suit for a private ceremony photo at a time when unions between partners of the same gender had no legal recognition in the United States or Europe. Photos like this are rare surviving evidence of couples who staged their own ceremonies despite the law. London, 1940. A double-decker bus lies nose down in a bomb crater while shop fronts on a main street stand ripped open by a recent night raid during the Blitz. Across that bombing campaign, more than 1 million London homes were damaged or destroyed. Yet trams, buses, and shops on streets like this often reopened within days. West Berlin children watch a United States C-54 Skymaster come in low over Tempelhof during the Berlin airlift of 1948 to 1949. Each day, hundreds of flights like this delivered coal, food, and medicine, keeping 2 million West Berliners supplied despite the Soviet land blockade. During the first year of the Great Depression in 1930, unemployed men in Times Square march in bowler hats and overcoats, wearing signs that offer to work for $1 a week. Their placards list any job they will take: porter, cook, painter, laborer, showing how fast white-collar workers were pushed into desperate street protests. New York, November 1920. Women step up to the ballot box in their first presidential election after the 19th Amendment banned voting restrictions based on sex. Their ballots join over 26 million cast nationwide, instantly making women nearly half of the United States electorate. A mother and her 2 children share a single narrow room in a New York tenement around 1910, with the bed, stove, wash basins, and storage trunk all packed into the same space. Peeling walls, cooking pots on the floor, and the lack of visible plumbing show how many tenement families lived without private running water, ventilation, or sanitation. On 11 May 1950, Paul Trent photographed this disc-shaped object over his farm near McMinnville, Oregon, creating one of the most studied classic UFO images. Investigators have never agreed whether the dark oval is a suspended model or something unexplained, so the photo still appears in official reviews of unidentified aerial sightings. In 1944, at Auschwitz-Birkenau, underground prisoners risked their lives to take this tilted photo as a column of inmates was marched through the trees toward the gas chambers. The film was smuggled out in a toothpaste tube to the Polish resistance and then to Allied intelligence, becoming one of the very few photos proving the killings inside the camp. Solina, Poland, 1961. Village children use homemade wooden stilts to cross the shallow Solina River on their way to school, keeping their clothes and books out of the water. The stilts let them take a direct line across the river instead of walking a long detour to the nearest bridge. September 1944, near Antwerp, a Belgian resistance nurse bandages a Canadian infantryman while his section covers the road during the fight to secure the vital port. Civilian volunteers like her guided Allied troops, passed on local intelligence, and treated wounded soldiers within meters of the front line. April 1945, on the road to Lemgo, tanks of the United States 2nd Armored Division move forward while captured German soldiers walk back with their hands on their heads. This scene comes from the division's final advance into northern Germany as it pushed past the Weser River and overran retreating armored units. Dust Bowl era, mid-1930s. A worn farm laborer stands in his bare wooden kitchen with his 3 children, showing how little shelter and comfort many rural families had during the Great Depression. In those years, about 1 in 4 American workers had no job, and government survey photos like this helped push for New Deal relief and farm support programs.